Guys, we recorded this a couple hours ago. Saagar Enjeti is a friend of mine. He's a co-host on The Hill with Crystal Ball. Crystal, of course, is on the show frequently. And I should say next week, we're going to be doing Wednesday instead of Tuesday because there's a debate. Wednesday, Crystal Ball is going to call in. We're going to do a segment with her. And then Ryan Grimm is going to be the in-studio guest. I'm very excited about this. That will be a very primary heavy show. I also regularly go on The Hill. I was just on the other day talking about Joe Biden rising, which a lot of people have been really digging. And it's a great show. And Saagar is the conservative co-host. So this is the first time that we've sort of done this on the show. This is a little bit of a debate. It's a discussion.
Firing line.
It's firing line. No, Saagar's a friend. I think these differences are interesting. You know, one of the reasons that I get kind of burned out and bored is I prefer sports in terms of watching conflict, and I don't find, sort of two people kind of madly sort of Googling things on each other to be particularly interesting. But I think a foundational worldview, distinctions and differences that are pretty relevant right now, especially if you accept the premise that I do, that I think even if a normal Democrat defeats Trump, I still think that the neoliberal order is at its seams and not going to be restored. And I do think that increasingly you will see a debate that centers on the axes of this conversation. So check it out. I really enjoyed it. We'll do it more with Saagar, and here it is. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is maybe actually the first conservative to be on this program, Saagar Enjeti. He's the co-host, the conservative co-host of Rising on the Hill. Of course, we've had Crystal Ball on before. You could see me on that great show. Saagar, thanks for breaking new ground with us. How you doing?
Oh, well, I'm so honored to be here, Michael. Thank you.
No, it's a real pleasure talking to you. And I think that there's value in, at the very least, non-traditional political disagreements, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And, I think before we get to some areas maybe of tension, I think we could start maybe at a meeting point, which is Joe Biden is trash. And I'd like you to talk about your reaction to Joe Biden. And, honestly, maybe even beyond that, I'll tell a quick self-aggrandizing story real quick.
Oh, please.
I have a good friend who is a Republican political strategist. And I told him in the beginning of 2015 or so, I said, dude, Jeb Bush is not going to happen. And he gave me whatever, communist podcaster, what do you know about the Republican electorate? I was like, I don't know, but I know that that's not going to happen, homie. And in the same vein, as a conservative, but somebody who I think does have an anti-corporate streak, what's your sort of read of the Democratic candidates and what kind of advice would you be giving them? So that's kind of a two-parter. Thoughts on Joe Biden, broader advice on the field.
Well, so, Michael, the interesting part, let's start from that little anecdote, is that I think socialists and nationalists both have a similar diagnosis of the problem, which is concentrated corporate control that doesn't necessarily care about the American worker. I think it has very, very legitimate concerns about the distribution of wealth, about the class. And really what the differences come down to are about how to address that fundamental question about redistribution and about what is the ultimate goal of the society. Now, what the neoliberals, on the other hand, don't actually agree with us on is that any of that is a problem, is that the declining wages of the American worker is a problem, that so much of our trade policy and others seems to be built for the benefit of others rather than for ourselves. They don't think that these are issues. So I think that's why you were able to call it from the Republican side. And I think that's why I can pretty confidently say that Joe Biden would not be a good president of the United States. And so when I look at somebody like Biden, I just look at so much of the emptiness behind so much of what he's proposing. And it really does. I talk about this on the show all the time, which is it's basically a one-legged stool, which is his entire candidacy is predicated on the single idea that he could beat Trump by swinging over the people who Trump won in 2016, and that he was Obama's vice president. we're not supposed to really ask any fundamental questions about whether he's changed his politics from the 1970s and the 1980s. And it really is that 1970s, 1980s consensus, which is what Joe Biden represents, and it's what Donald Trump and so much of what the new right, and I think that the progressive left understands, cannot be the solution. And it's funny because Joe Biden and Jeb Bush may be members of different parties, but very much in the way that you and I or Crystal and I might share the diagnosis of what the problem is, they very much share what the consensus view. So on tax policy, it's really not that radically different about how far they are apart. On trade policy, they're almost exactly the same. The fundamental questions of how our society should be ordered are things that they actually agree upon. And so that's something that, from the right is what I can diagnose about why Biden is bad and why I think he'd be a bad president. And I think, I from a self-interested perspective, I'd like to see him nominated. This is outside of all the political stuff about Ukraine and about corruption and about all of that. I think he is an extraordinarily weak candidate. And this is also outside of his age. Now, in terms of the Democratic side, I think that one of the most interesting things that's happening right now is the three-way narrowing of the race. You have Bernie Sanders, and I think Bernie Sanders has been legitimately honest and has been so foresighted in his diagnosis of the problem from the very beginning. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the solutions to those problems, but I think that that's a different thing. The real question I think Democrats are going to have to answer is not really the Biden question. It's really the Elizabeth Warren question, because this is somebody who appears to be splitting the difference whenever it comes to pretty important shibboleths, is how I would call them, for people who are on the left. And this is something Crystal has really opened my eyes upon. When we look at things like Medicare for All, or we look at what her, about corporate money in particular, and what she said, she used to take it, now she's not taking it, she's not ruling it out. And so from my perspective, what I saw in 2016 with Trump was that, look, immigration really was the number one issue for Republican voters. And every single Republican candidate had some version of immigration restriction. I mean, there was comprehensive immigration, yeah, but really, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, so many others, they had some version of we need to secure the border. But nobody actually trusted them in order to actually carry that out. Mm-hmm. And so if the number one voting issue for the Democratic side is healthcare, which is what much of the polling data indicates, then the candidates need to trust that whoever they were to put into the White House will actually do what they say. And so if I were to put on the hat of, I think, somebody like you, somebody like Crystal, any Medicare for All or single payer proponent, why would you trust that Barack Obama's vice president, who instituted Obamacare, who has basically refused in order to adopt a true single payer system from the outright, and saying that some sort of negotiated solution will be the answer, how could I possibly trust that person to carry out that solution if that is what I believe is the actual solution to the problem? And I think that so many of these candidates, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, and many others, are trying to split the difference with some of the most ridiculous named policies I've ever heard. I mean, Medicare for all who want it, Medicare for Americans, Medicare for choice, I think is what Kamala said. I mean, some of these are, they're ludicrous, right? I mean, right. It's just absolutely, and it's something that it very much reminds me of the immigration debate on the right, which is, Trump actually had the simplest solution of all. He was like, I'm going to build a wall. And it can sound silly, but, and Trump actually did want to build a wall, but I think it was more about signaling, which is, I will come through for you on this one issue. And that is why people voted for him. And that's why I think that if you're a Democratic voter right now, parsing the past record of Elizabeth Warren on Medicare for All might actually be the most important thing in this primary.
Yeah, I actually buy a lot of that. Before, not surprisingly, you just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.